All right. Good afternoon. My name is Kenya Abraham. I'm the Organic Transition Program Manager here at Oak. And we are going to have a very special session with Greg Halich. Did I say that right? Cool. Last time I didn't. Greg is with the University of Kentucky, and he's a grass-finished cattle farmer. And we are going to have the session of Herbal Leys and Pasture-cropping, intercropping deep-rooted Forbs, and annual forages into cattle pastures. I just want to say that I'm going to pass these around and put them on every table, and if you could please fill out the cards before you leave the room. They're very important to the work we do here at Oak, and it really does matter. We listen to your feedback and make changes accordingly. So thanks for your participation. And without further ado, here's Greg.
All right, let me be a little softer. So I do like walking around. I do not like standing behind that lectern. So if you don't mind, I might walk around. The other thing, I don't mind a bit if you ask questions while we're going along. Now, this is a new presentation. I have a few slides I've used in the past, but for the most part, most of this is new information that you've probably not seen. That said, it will be a little unpolished. I will say that right now. And normally I like telling a story with a lot of pictures, and I do that, but I'm missing a few pictures I need to fill in the next year or so for this. So that said, ask questions as we go along. We should have plenty of time. And I will say this, so we're covering two things here, Herbal Leys and pasture cropping. And really the focus is on the Herbal Leys. That's where I think the most benefit is going to be for most people here, if you're a cattle farmer or livestock farmer. But the pasture cropping fits into that just a little bit. And so I'm going to cover that first, pasture cropping, and then we'll get into Herbal Leys. That said, the Herbal Leys is what I want to focus most on, and it is what we'll focus the most on. So again, I like to tell stories, and this is one that I'll have to update the pictures. So this is a picture of the farm that I'm going to talk about, but it's the only picture I have. It isn't going to tell the story I want to. But this is the Ley farm. It's a 500-acre farm in southern Woodford County, which is where I'm from. It's probably the biggest still intact farm in that part of the county that I know of. And the farm is since sold, but the farmers that were on this they did both livestock and grain. So they did corn, soybeans, just conventionally, everything conventionally. And so not right here, but on the main part of the farm where the house is and where the barns are, they'd store their machinery in an old tobacco barn, and I would drive by there occasionally. And so sometime a month or so after they were done planting, so probably in mid-June or so, I drove around the corner, and in that pasture, not far from the tobacco barn where they stored the machinery, I saw a line of corn plants. You know, they looked like they're about 1.5 feet, 2 foot tall, but I thought it's like that doesn't make any sense, and it took me about a half a minute to realize what happened is they were done planting in the spring, and they probably had one row that still had some corn seed in it. So instead of, because I've done this before, for 10 years I row crop, so instead of digging all that out, they simply just took the tractor on the backside of the barn, the pasture, dropped the no-till drill, and just ran it until the light went off and they're done seeding. That was their quick and easy way of getting rid of the seed. And so anyways, what I was amazed by is, like, I would have never bet that those corn plants would have grown up through that sod and would be doing that well. Again, they'd only been there for like a month. So kind of forgot about it because I only went by there every few weeks, and probably in 2 or 3 weeks to let the cattle in there, and they ate it down, it was done with. So completely kind of forgot about that until the next winter, and I stole this picture, so that's why it's a little bit fuzzy. And so this will tie into the previous. So this is in Australia. This is Colin Seiss, who I read and saw a few YouTube videos that next winter. And what he was doing in Australia is something he called pasture cropping. So you can see the strips of green in there, and he's harvesting a wheat crop. So what he was doing, this is Australia, it gets very warm, probably warmer than Kentucky. So they typically have warm season perennials for their pasture instead of cool seasons that we have. So what he has in the green there is some type of warm season perennial pasture. And what he started doing, experimenting, and then at large scale, is he would wait until fall, when the warm season perennial slowed down and started going somewhat dormant, he would no-till into the wheat into that. He would also suppress it with his cattle. He has, I think, both cattle and sheep. So before he would do that, he would graze it hard to set it back even more, no-till in, and maybe afterwards even graze it one more time, I don't remember. But the end result is he actually got a wheat crop. Now, it probably wasn't a record wheat crop, but he had almost no inputs. All he did is he planted into it, no herbicide, no fertilizer, no nothing. Low input, he would get a decent crop the next year, and then he would have it to graze again. So the light bulb went off when I started reading about this, and what I realized in Kentucky, so what he was doing, he would plant in the fall. That wheat would create most of its biomass when? In late winter, early spring, which we don't really need that in Kentucky, right? We have an excess of pasture production in the spring and early summer. So when the light bulb went off, it was, well, what if we could fill that summertime with something like what? Corn or some warm season annual, right? And so that's when I connected those two things, or those two different events. And so that next spring, or that next summer, I decided I was going to try that. And so this is the first farm I have in southern Woodford County. And then, what I did is, and I'll give you the details of how I did this here in a second, but basically I no-tilled a male sterile grazing corn into my perennial sod. And I did it on 2 locations on my farm down there, and then 2 lease farms I had right adjacent. This was on a lease farm. So that looks decent. So that was mid-August. So I planted mid-June. I was grazing that probably 55 days after I planted it. It was actually doing poorly because it was on one of the lease farms that had poor fertility. Organic matter hadn't been built up, and there wasn't good nutrient cycling and poor biological cycling. But it didn't do bad, but I decided to graze a little bit earlier. The cattle were in that area, so I grazed it down. What I'm going to show you next was on my farm. It did have about 5 more days. So this picture, the next one was about 5-6 days later, but you can see the difference. And so this at the time had about 5.25% organic matter. It's up to 6.5 right now. But you can see I planted it directly into the sod. You can see the grass there. And what I never would have guessed that that corn would have done that well. That was about 60 days exactly after planting. Would you all agree that's a pretty good crop given it was into a sod? Now you have to do some things we'll talk about. You need to suppress it. We'll talk about the details here a little bit. Now the next picture was even better. So I took it probably 5 minutes after the next picture is right there but a different angle. So let's look at that. You can see where they've grazed. Now the cattle were just in there for like half a day. They will come back and clean up those stalks before they touch the grass. It's that sweet. So they completely decimate that, and then I'll give them another strip. What I was doing though, that wasn't their sole crop. I probably planted not quite 3 acres of that on 60 acres of total land that I had there. So I was using almost as a supplement. They would have a couple acres of pasture, and they would get a small strip of that grazing corn. Now the next picture was about 150 feet to the right. There's a fence row about right there, and it's on the other side of that fence row. So it's on the other pasture that had even a little bit better fertility. That step-in post, that's a fiberglass step-in post. It's probably 4.5 feet tall that you're looking at. That corn was, I'm not kidding you, 10 feet tall, 60 days after planting. So I was amazed. Now I will say we had perfect conditions. It rained like an inch and a half every single week, and we'll talk about that. Rainfall is a big part of this. So I had perfect conditions, but what I found is if you do something like that on really good fertility, you will get a good response. This was on the second rental farm that I had, but it was probably about 90 days after planting. That was the last of the grazing corn that I had left. That was in late September, early October, I believe. Now, I'm not going to encourage you to plant the grazing corn for a number of reasons. It's a one-and-done crop. It won't regrow very well. The only reason I did it is at the time I was row cropping at small scale, and I had access to no-till corn planter. It was just the easiest thing for me to do. What I'm going to show you next would be, if you are interested in this, my recommendation. So this is a good friend of mine, Jason Tower. He is a superintendent at CPAC, Southern Indiana, Purdue Agricultural Center. Very innovative. He does a lot. He and I talk all the time. We drove down to North Carolina here a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about this. So he sent me this series of pictures here. That is sorghum Sudan that you see there, but he's using the same method, which I will describe how to set back the pasture, that sort of thing. But the nice thing about sorghum Sudan is you don't have to have a corn planter. He did this with a standard no-till drill. The seed is a lot cheaper, and it's also a lot more flexible. The grazing corn, I literally had to keep them out of those areas for 60 days or more, because again, if they hit it early, that will not come back, or it won't come back well. So this would be my recommendation, not the grazing corn. That was just kind of telling the story. A few more pictures. This was a few weeks after he planted it, 1 year, obviously. And if things go well, and he'll be the first to say it's not always going to look that good, but if things go well, you can see how wonderful that looked. Again, that is into a permanent sod. It doesn't always look that good, so he said this is if things don't go right. It'll still be decent, but it's not going to be that beautiful stand like you saw before. I would argue, though, even that is well worth the seed that he put into it. They have both sheep and cattle. Sheep love it also. And the only warning I would give you for a sorghum Sudan is that you do have to worry about prussic acid poisoning. So this was after a frost, and that's why he sent me this picture. So you get a really hard frost, and I don't understand all the dynamics, but basically it will create essentially cyanide in the plant. So you have to stay off it for like a week or so, but then after that you can graze it down. It won't have the same nutritional value, but you can still graze it. So you do have to think about that in your overall system. But by the way, let me back up. It would be no difference than if you had Johnson grass in that pasture. You've got the same problem, which, by the way, I love Johnson grass. That is a perennial version of this, right? So one thing I will point out with Jason, I did not see this until a couple days ago, and I saw it. I'll highlight it. You can't see it quite as well as I can see on the screen, but I asked him about this. Can you all see the tracks up there a little bit? So he did fertilize that with turkey manure. I guess they have turkey house up there. And so he said, and I know Jason, I've been on that farm. He has built the organic matter up really well. I don't think he needs to use a nitrogen source like that anymore, but he did. He's still transitioning to, he's never going to be an organic person, but he's moving more in that direction. But he was still the mindset that I've got to get some nitrogen down for that. And so what he says is once that sorghum Sudan gets above the canopy of the cool season grass, he'll put down turkey litter, or even some cases, urea or something like that. By the way, I did not do that. All that corn that you saw, no fertilizer, and universally on both farms I have not put down any commercial fertilizer on either of them. All right, so the details here. How did he and I do that? And I want to be clear. I've only done this one time personally, and I did have like a perfect summer in terms of we had rain every single week about. But Jason has done this every year for probably 7 or 8 years. So a lot of this is relying on him in terms of what he's learned in the process. So in terms of establishing, again, it's a perennial sod, so you want to start setting that back. So you graze it when you normally would in the spring, but start grazing it hard. In other words, normally you want to be very careful to what? Not abuse your pastures, right? When you do this, you've got the green light to do what? You want to abuse that pasture because you want to start setting it back. So graze it harder than you want to. That may mean you're leaving them on an extra day or two. In other words, normally you take them off a little bit earlier, leave them on there another day or two. Abuse that pasture. And then the last time you do that, before you plant, you really want to hit it hard. So in other words, maybe the first 1 or 2 times you just graze as normal, but the time you do it right before planting, you definitely want to abuse it then. And if you're in a position where the cattle aren't in the right place at the right time, don't be afraid to mow it. In other words, get the bush hog out, set it as low as you can, and mow it as low as you can. You want to set it back as best you can. In terms of timing, again, I'm guessing on some of this, but probably sometime in June here in Kentucky, early to late June. The theory is you don't want to plant until the cool season pasture I'm not going to say going dormant, but start slowing down. So think about our typical cool season pastures. When do they start slowing down? Usually sometime in June. So that's when you want to time that planting to about the time that pasture is going to start slowing down. And I did not do this the year I did that grazing corn, and Jason said he rarely does this, because this is one of those things where in theory this is going to help, but in practice with all the other things that we have going on at that time, it doesn't always get done. But if I could say this is what you should follow, probably a week to week and a half after you plant it, after the whatever you plant has emerged, but before it's tall enough where either the cattle can get it or you'd mow it with a bush hog, hit it again. In other words, if the grass the perennial grass has about a week and a half of growth, that's a perfect time to what? If you want to suppress it, to mow it again. So think of yourself as a put your mindset in terms of a continual grazer. That's, you want to essentially hurt that pasture at that point. Last thing, pray for rain, right? Because we can do everything right, but if it's a dry summer like this last year, I can promise you I would have not had any, the corn that I planted would have looked nothing like what I showed you. Now that said, on a year that's dry, even if I get half that production, that's going to be worth a whole lot more, right, in that year than a year of good rainfall, because you're short on forage supply. All right, here's a couple ideas. I did not do this that year, and Jason doesn't do this, but if I was going to do it again, the time that I graze it right before I plant it, I would actually, to be out there longer than I really would normally have the cattle, I would actually set 1 or 2 hay bales out there in that pasture to allow me to do what? Stay on that pasture a little bit longer. Again, with the purpose of really trying to set that back. And again, do not be afraid to mow. I know there's a lot of people that think we should be able to mob graze and never put a mower out there. I'm not one of them, but particularly here, if you can have that investment in sorghum sedan, in terms of the seed, the cost of your tractor, the no-till drill, all that, do everything that you can to set back that pasture. And that may mean in some cases you want to mow rather than have the cattle out there, because cattle may not be in a place where it's convenient. All right, in terms of factors that determine success, we talked about the first one. It's, the amount of rainfall that we get in mid to late summers, and really probably midsummer, is going to make or break how successful you are. Mid more than late summer, probably. Again, setting back that perennial pasture, so how well you do will be a big function of how well of a job that you do on that component. The third one, and this is really a double-edged sword, is how healthy is your pasture? The more, in general, the higher your organic matter, the more nitrogen release you're going to have, the less need you're going to have to do something like what Jason did there. Now, the double-edged sword of that, and by the way, the first picture I showed you on the rental pasture, that was a function of that. In other words, I had just taken over that farm, and the first picture I showed you that I grazed early, the organic matter was a couple percentage points lower than my base farm, and there just was not a whole lot of nitrogen cycling there. Now, had I added urea or something, it would have done a whole lot better, but I chose not to do that. So anyways, organic matters, and we're here at organic conference, right? So we don't want to do that. Although we could do the turkey litter, I'm guessing, right? Or municipal sludge with PFAS in it, right? I think that qualifies. So anyways, the double-edged sword, though, is the better your organic matter, the harder you get the job you're going to do of slowing down that perennial pasture. And that's one thing I found. As organic matter increases, it's going to take longer in the summer for that perennial side to really slow down. So in other words, if you've got good organic matter, be thankful, but you're going to have to go to even better efforts to suppress that sod by hammering it really hard to control the fescue and other cool season grasses. All right, so main species, again, I've only done this with grazing corn, and Jason has only done it with sorghum sudan, but I'm going to show you what other possibilities and what I've heard. So what I would recommend, just based on what Jason has done, how successful is, if you're going to do that, sorghum sudan would be my number one option. That's what I would want you to do. Sudan grass, I do not know anyone that's done that, but given sorghum sudan is half Sudan grass, it probably would work fine also. But I would be more cautious, maybe experiment, do a bag of Sudan grass and the rest sorghum sudan to see what the differences are. Pearl millet, just based on what I know about it, would probably also work very fine. And then, of course, I use the grazing corn. It worked great in terms of biomass, but it was a pain in the butt. For 60 days, every time the cattle went into that pasture, I had to fence that portion off so the cattle couldn't get into it. And it just, logistically, and the reason I didn't continue doing it is because logistics were difficult. And again, this is not exclusive. There's probably other species that work just fine. My recommendation is if you think you might do one, just experiment. I love doing experiments. And see, just don't go whole hog. Don't do a 20, 30 acre pasture. Try a bag of whatever you're thinking of doing. Now again, Jason or myself, we didn't, he did pure sorghum sudan, I did pure grazing corn, but there's no reason you couldn't have a mix in there. Again, sorghum sudan would be my recommendation as your primary, but add something else in there for soil health. So something like cowpeas that will fix its own nitrogen. Buckwheat, just in terms of, especially if you're low in phosphorus, put some of that in there, you'll help cycle phosphorus in the system. Long run more than that particular year. Sunflowers, they do a lot more of that in like the Dakotas, but my understanding is sunflowers would probably work as a secondary addition in that mix. Sun hemp, kind of same thing. I've not personally used it, but everything I understand about it, it would probably be good in that mix. And then other things might work also. So this is something I read about years ago. So, and everyone probably knows Gabe Brown, but this is something that at least quite a few years ago he was doing when he was converting cropland back into perennial pastures. I think more so than a perennial system. But he would do a summer seeding just like we're talking about. He'd follow it up with doing the same thing like Colin Seiss did in the fall for the winter time. And so he would, in the summer seeding, that would be a warm season, fall seeding would be a cool season. He would just basically do that 2 or 3 years in a row to basically push back that sod and get whatever he wanted into that perennial pasture. Again, I've never done it, Jason's never done it, I'm giving you some ideas here. Now what he claimed was, whoops, let me back up. By doing that, you will continue to kind of weaken the perennial, especially like if you have really strong fescue. After doing that 2 or 3 times, you're setting back that fescue, because you definitely do. Even the one year I did it, because that fescue is being shaded out, right? So it's a little bit weaker now. It comes back good in late fall, but if you plant that fall planting of the cool season annuals into it, that's the time to do it before it kind of fully recovers. And so by doing that multiple times, he's purposely weakening the perennials to get whatever he wants in that sod to be their long run. So in other words, he's doing the short run to get whatever species he wants in that pasture long run, if that makes sense. All right, so let's look at costs real quick. And I'm not even doing this for grazing corn because I really don't think I would advise or I would recommend doing, if you're going to do this, sorghum sudan. So Jason doesn't do a full, like if you're doing a 100% stand of sorghum sudan, you do a little bit more than that, probably 25 pounds or something, but he would recommend somewhere between 15 and 18 pounds. So seed costs somewhere between $15 and $20 an acre. No-till drill and tractor, and this is if you're valuing your time fully and depreciation on the tractor and all that, so your cash costs would be less than that, but assuming we're putting all the true costs in there, probably about $25 an acre. And then if you have to clip it, same thing. If you're valuing your time, depreciation of the tractor, your cash cost of clipping is probably $5 or less. But if you're valuing it fully, if we add all that up, depending on if you clip or not, somewhere between $40 and $60 an acre. Now here, I did not do this, but this is a question that I have, and probably some of you should too, especially if you're like me. So who here would classify their farm as not a big farm, like a small to medium sized? All right, so I don't know what your all experience is, but with me, in theory, it's nice to be able to go, and I can go rent a no-till drill at a very reasonable price. It's in town, 8, 9 miles away. But if all I'm gonna do is 4 or 5 acres, what sounds like a low cost, ends up, I will spend, I promise you, almost half a day between going out there to get it, calibrating it, bringing it back, worrying about that. One time, one of the discs fell off and I spent 2 hours going back to, which I found it. But my point is, if you're doing 50 acres or 100 acres, yeah, that no-till drill go for it, right? But if you're like me, it's hard for me to justify going out to rent that no-till drill. So basically, and this is one reason I'm not doing the pasture cropping with this stuff. I'll show you what I do now here in a second. But unless I can broadcast it, I'm probably not gonna do it. So I have not tried it yet, but I'm just saying it may be possible. Can you broadcast it? Answer is I don't know for sure. What I'm saying is you might want to experiment with it, But obviously, if you're going to do that, don't go whole hog. Don't do 10 acres. Do like one bag, right? One bag of sorghum sudan, maybe 2 acres, something like that. But do the same thing, seed right before grazing. But obviously, suppression of that sod is going to be even more important if you broadcast it than if you drill it in there. So warning there. Oh, most important thing, if you do it, let me know how it works. Good or bad, right? My hunch is it's going to be difficult. It may be possible, but I don't know for sure. So if you try it, whether it works or doesn't, please let me know, because that may help someone else out, right, that asked that question. All right, so what I'm going to show you now is what I personally do for my pasture cropping. It's not a pure, what most people call pure pasture cropping, because, and let me back up to see people asking the question. Whoops, let me go back. Yeah, I didn't put this on here, but I think what I saw in the back is if you get hoof action, that might do it. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Yep. And I should have expounded on it. That's why I said seed right before grazing. In other words, if you seed it right before that heavy grazing, I'm glad you guys did that. I knew what you were saying, I thought. But in other words, if you seed it before you graze it, the cattle might, and even more reason to leave them out there for another day or two. Set a bale of hay out there, right? Even though most of us, putting hay out in June is like a grazer's sin, right? That's the last thing we ever want to do. But it will be, my guess is if you're going to broadcast it, definitely put that 1 or 2 bales out there to leave them out there even longer, so that they will be more likely to trample that seed into the ground. Again, let me know how it works. All right, so again, I pretty much, if I can't broadcast it effectively, I'm not going to do it. So what I do, and I did this far before I ever did that, the planting of the grazing corn, I found annual Lesbides essentially is, you will plant this earlier. You're not going to have to graze it hard in June like we did, but it's going to give you the same results because it's a warm season legume. Almost all of its growth is going to be in June, July, and August, just like sorghum sudan or anything else. But it's going to be a whole lot easier management-wise for just about anyone, particularly a small farm, to implement this versus the sorghum sudan or the grazing corn. And I did talk about this last year, so I'm just showing a couple slides here. It's warm season legume. That picture was taken in mid-July on the rental farm next to that same farm I showed you. And that was a close-up picture. So roughly a foot of beautiful, high protein, high energy forage. But again, you'll see that typically in late or mid to late March, and you don't have to do all the things we talked about in terms of suppressing that sod. So it's a whole lot easier management-wise, and will give you basically the same results or better. And I showed this last year, again, most of the production summertime. The other thing that works, especially if you have a poor fertility situation, if you do sorghum sudan, you're gonna have to put down a whole lot of fertilizer or chicken litter or whatever. Annual Lesbides, since it's a legume, will create its own nitrogen. And it will build up the fertility of that soil. It broadcasts easily. I usually use 8 to 10 pounds on something that's new. If I'm doing it every year, I'll probably just do 5 to 6 pounds, because it will reseed itself to some degree. Here is what you need to remember. It took me at least 6 or 7 years for me to figure this out. By the way, it wasn't on any extension publication or anything like that. So it has no frost tolerance. Once it develops its first 2 set of leaves, it might live at 31 degrees, but once it gets down 29 degrees or lower, it will wipe it out. So if you seed it in, say, February, when you do clover, and let's say we get 5 days where it gets up in the 50s in early to mid-March, and it germinates, and then it puts up its first 2 true leaves a week later, what are the chances, let's say in mid-March, that we don't have a killing frost in Kentucky? Slim to none, right? So if you're going to do it, wait, like I do now. Again, it took me about 7 years or so to figure that out. Wait until about mid-March before you seed Lesbides. Let me skip through here. Here's the other good news in terms of cost compared to sorghum sudan. It's going to be about half the cost. Seed, I don't know what it's going to be this year. The last 2 years, it's been really high. Hopefully, the seed will come down to more normal prices. But if you do 8 to 12 pounds, and let's hope it's nowhere close to 30, but last year it probably was. Let's hope it's closer to that 15, but I'm giving you a range there. Broadcasting it just with a hand broadcaster, probably $5 an acre. And so hopefully we'll be on the low side of that, $20 to $25 an acre, about half what the sorghum sudan would be. and a whole lot easier management, in terms of the seeding itself. So that is what I'd recommend, and all this is going to fit into the Herbal Leys that is going to be the main focus here in a second. So any questions up to this point regarding the pasture cropping, whether it's sorghum Sudan or the Lesbadisa, which is important because this is going to feed into the main focus of what we're going to talk about here today.
Do you have any experience with running horses and cattle together in kind of like a Christmas?
Yeah, the question is, do I have any experience with horse and cattle? No, I don't. I grew up with horses, but we didn't do a rotational grazing. So the answer is no, unfortunately, I don't. So maybe we can talk afterwards and better understand your specific concern. Other questions related to that? All right. We've talked about this. Basically, I'm putting these side by side. My recommendation, if you are going to do one of these two, for most people here, I think hands down the annual and by the way, when I say annual Lesbadisa, that's going to mean Korean Lesbadisa. Like if you go try to buy it, some seed place will call it annual Lesbadisa. Most will probably call it Korean Lesbadisa. And by the way, if you at your local feed store, most of the time they're not going to have it, but most of the time they can order it. In other words, most places there's not enough demand for them to have seed on hand. But about everyone that has talked to me about this, when they told me when they went back and called or were at their local feed place, they're able to order it. So just keep that in mind. They might not have it, they can probably order it for you. So let's talk about the Herbal Leys now, and this is the focus, and this is where I think this is one of the most underutilized tools that livestock farmers probably potentially have but aren't using. We'll talk about the history, but the only reason I learned about it is I read about it in a book. They used to do this in England 2 centuries ago, and it was fairly popular up through the 1950s, and then when commercial fertilizer became popular, it just kind of went away. But there has been a resurgence, I would say, the last 10 years or so. So what you're looking at is on my second farm, and this is where I'm doing it primarily. We'll talk about that later on why. But this is what it kind of looks like in the spring and fall. We'll talk about summer here in a bit. But you can see the Forbs there, right? Chicory, plantain, and I'll point them out here in a second. But that's kind of what we're shooting for when I say Herbal Leys. Now, a traditional ley mixture is not just the Forbs, and that's the most important component of it, but in England, what they typically traditionally did is they would mix in probably a third of the Forbs, we'll talk about those, but they would mix in with cool season grasses, so orchard grass, perennial ryegrass, that sort of thing, timothy, and they'd also mix in with our common clover, so red and white clover, maybe even a little bit of alfalfa, that sort of thing. Now, we'll talk about how we probably want to modify this for Kentucky conditions in a bit, but just understand if you read about Herbal Leys, and I'm going to provide a few references for you to be able to do that, that's what they're going to be talking about. But also understand that's England, and they have a very different climate than we do here in Kentucky, particularly when? During the summertime, right? So keep that in mind. And so we'll focus on the Forbs in terms of what you probably want to look for. And understand that some of these Forbs I'm going to show to you aren't readily available. I'll tell you which ones are, which ones aren't. That doesn't mean they couldn't be. It's just that there's not enough demand right now to get them here, right? So the ones that I use and can get consistently would be chicory, plantain, and then burnet. And out of those three, chicory and plantain are probably 80% of my biomass for the Forbs, and burnet's a little less. Mainly because it's a little bit more difficult to seed because the seed is really big with the burnet. So it's a little trickier to broadcast effectively, unless you're doing it with small grains, what I found. Now, the ones with asterisks behind them, sandfoin and alfalfa, I label them as Forbs, but they're really legumes. But I'm labeling them as Forbs for this purpose because they both have really deep taproots. And all these Forbs, and that is the main advantage of them, that is their strength. They've got super deep, super strong taproots that can get down way deep in the soil profile and get to minerals and nutrients that would otherwise not be available. So they're not true Forbs, but I consider them Forbs for our purposes. Now, the two that I would love to try that have not been able to, and I'll point this out later on, if you can find the seed, please let me know. I will go in on shipping with you if you know, whatever. But I would love to get sheep's parsley, because actually my favorite book on this, sheep's parsley was his favorite herb out of all those. And then yarrow. Now, we have wild yarrow, right? And I've got a little bit of wild yarrow in one of my pastures, but it's sporadic. I mean, you might have to, you know, search 5 minutes between plants, but apparently cattle love this. So if you can find that seed also, please let me know. And collectively, we could all go and ship it from England or something on a pallet load, right? And it'd probably be reasonable to do. All right, so this is kind of what a good herbal ley in Kentucky would look like. I will point out the chicory. Probably most of you know what chicory looks like. It's a little bit wider leaf. It has serrations on it. And then now what I'm going to show you now is the plantain. Understand these are improved varieties. So typically if you see wild plantain, there's two types of wild plantain. There's what I call long leaf plantain and the wide leaf. But either of those, typically if you find them naturally growing in your pastures, they're usually super low growing. And you usually won't see leaves that stick up like that. So keep that in mind. These are improved varieties that have been bred for forage production. And even though the wild varieties are still very palatable and good, these are an improvement on them for our livestock. Here's Burnet. This is like my latest edition. So I did chicory and plantain for, I don't know, at least 3-4 years before I introduced Burnet. And I love Burnet. It's more of a cool season, so it does grow in the summer, but it will grow a whole lot better in cool conditions than the other two. By the way, some people purposely plant this for salads, to mix in with salads. I've not tried it yet, but I should. The only problem with Burnet is it's a really, really big seed. So it is hard to broadcast. I'm assuming you can no-till it in, but again, pretty much if I can't broadcast, I'm not going to do it. But if you try seeding it with a typical clover mix or something, it's too big. You'll have to open the settings so high that you'll be doing like 30 pounds of clover to the acre or something ridiculous. So the only time I've found that I can seed it effectively is if I mix it in with, and we'll talk about this later on, but in the fall, I will mix in wheat and rye into this herbal ley, and you're doing like 75 pounds to the acre, so you'll have it really wide open, and the Burnet will go through that opening fine. So keep that in mind. You can do Burnet, but you're probably going to have to do it with something like a small grain if you're broadcasting it, or at least that's my experience. Here's the history. So, and quickly, any questions up to this point? Does this look interesting? Something like your cattle might enjoy? Okay. All right, so here, I just put a little bit in history, and this is obviously not complete, but just very quickly. The best I can find, it really started becoming popular in England in the mid-19 or 1800s, somewhere in that time period. And the first person to really write about it and really kind of promote it was Robert Eliot. And I don't know England as well as I should have, but apparently I think he's in the northern part, maybe not Scotland, but part of northern England that is not great fertility. And so his soils were wearing out, or they were wore out by the time he got that farm. And apparently wheat prices and small grain prices were really low at that time, so he had a double whammy. His soils were low in productivity. Doing conventional wheat, barley, whatever they did at the time was not very profitable, and so he was losing money. And so he had to come up with another system, whatever conventional was at that time that would work. And what he found was by integrating those herbs in short rotations, like 3, 4, 5-year rotations, that they do the deep-root herbs mixed in with grass and clovers, and then back into wheat or barley, whatever, for a couple of years. That's where he actually was getting good enough yields at low enough costs where he made money on that cash crop. So he did that. A lot of other people started writing about that time, and it became very popular until roughly somewhere around World War I. I assume that's when commercial fertilizer became more accessible. Also in England, they became a whole lot more intense because they had to, World War I was terrible. My understanding is they just lost a lot of grazing land at that time, and the government was promoting we need more cereals, more cereals, more cereals. So for whatever reason, the popularity kind of dropped off pretty dramatically, and it was revived for a short period of time by this person called Newman Turner in the 1950s, and that's who I learned about Herbal Leys from. He's got a book. I'll show you both. Actually, he's got like 3 or 4 books two of them that I would highly recommend if you're interested in doing anything with Herbal Leys. So one of them is called Fertility Pastures, the other is Fertility Farming. They both have a little bit of information, the others don't, but if you're only gonna get one of the two books, get Fertility Pastures. It does a more complete job. This is the book. It's published by Acres USA, so you can get it very easily. So if you're interested in this, the best advice I can give to you, buy that book. And by the way, not just for Herbal Leys, he was definitely a thinker. He was also a full-time farmer, but just someone that was very inquisitive. So you will learn a lot from this book that, other than Herbal Leys, that may not be directly applicable because we're in such a different climate. And also, you know, I had to adjust the Herbal Leys he was talking about for Kentucky. But the overall process of getting you to think about some other ideas, I cannot, if I was going to recommend one book just in general on pastures and livestock, it would be that one right there just to learn from, to get you thinking. All right, so importance of Forbs here. So one, they're deep-rooted like we've talked about, and I'll show you a picture here to help reinforce that. So chicory is on the left. So this is from New Zealand. I stole this slide. They call it ribgrass, but that's plantain. It's on the right. So if you look at those, compare them to our typical pasture plants, what do you notice right away? They're very deep roots. And so not just in terms of accessing nutrients that might not otherwise be there. So typically our upper profile, you know, that's where our grasses and clovers, that's what they deplete first, right? Because that's where the roots are. But also, and we'll see this later on, kind of towards the end, but most with our typical pasture plants, most of the organic matter is going to be built in the top 4 to 5 inches because that's where the roots are. So if we can put plants in there, in that mix, that have deeper root systems, guess what we can start doing at those lower levels? Adding organic matter, which is really difficult, if not impossible, to do with conventional plants that we typically have. So we'll look at that towards the end. So the deep roots give us extra minerals, and we'll look at a few studies on that. And I was actually amazed. I had just heard about it and knew about it because I've seen it personally, but until I started doing some research for this presentation, so this was good, I can kind of quantify in terms of how much more minerals something like those deep-rooted forbs will have compared to conventional pasture plants. And here's another nice thing, especially for organic system. Now, this is something that hasn't been tested very well, but some of these deep-rooted herbs supposedly also have good properties to help with parasites. So it will basically be a natural dewormer. The two that I know of that are most talked about will be chicory and sandfoin. Again, sandfoin is actually a legume, and we'll show that picture here in a little bit. And I can quantify that with one of the two studies I'm going to show you, that it, in fact, does make a big difference. I don't know how big but I think cattle, they're like you and me, just having extra variety out there is a good thing, right? Even if it doesn't have direct health benefits, it just makes animals happier, it makes people happier if you're eating more than 2 or 3 different things. And again, I mentioned that long run, we can really increase the organic matter of our soils because we can do that in lower profiles versus the upper 4 or 5 inches. All right, so I got a few slides from green. So first of all, who has seen green cover seeds before or heard of them? Row croppers know of them more because they've been really instrumental in doing cover crops for corn, soybean, wheat rotations. But I would encourage everyone to look at their website. They've got some really good information. By the way, I've looked at buying from them, and their seed price looked good, but when you find out how much it's going to cost to ship it, you've looked at the same thing, it's like, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me. So unless you're going to do a pallet load, which you might, like if you go in with 2 or 3 other people, do a pallet load, it might make it worthwhile. But if you're going to buy 2 or 3 bags, you're not going to want to go through them, unfortunately. But I'm stealing a few slides from here. So here's what their description of chicory. Just read a few different things. So deep-rooted forb, I knew about that. Here's the other thing, ability to reach minerals in soil, blah, blah. Again, I knew about this. And again, this has been said many times, and we'll show you some data on this here in a little bit. But according to them, again, they've got very good natural deworming ability of that plant. We'll look at that here in just a little bit. Here's plantain, low-growing forb that, like chicory, is high in minerals. I will just quantify that typically wild varieties are low-growing, but on good fertility with improved varieties, it won't be a low-growing. I mean, it's not going to be 2 or 3 feet tall, but it will be, it can easily give you 8 to 10 inches of really good high nutrition forage. So I would change that slightly if I was writing that. Natural antibiotic compound that helps reduce infections. Hopefully you're not going to have a need for that, but if you do, I guess that's a good thing. But here's what I found out that I did not, this next thing I'm going to point out I did not know, so I'll read it for you. Modifies rumen fermentation to improve animal performance, similar to an IN4 like rumensin. Now, this is an organic crowd, so some of you may not know what rumensin is, right? But if you go to a typical extension cattle meeting, they will promote rumensin because it increases gain and also increases efficiency of the feed conversion. So I personally don't want to ever add something like rumensin, but if I can get it naturally through a plant, guess what? That is beautiful. That's nature working at her best. All right, so I stole this slide also. This, and by the way, this will be in the reference section. So this is what they're showing as the mineral decline last 50 years. Go ahead, go through. And it comes from Coltswold Seed. They're in England, and they have a really good PDF publication. I'll give you the link at the end. I highly recommend that you look at that if you're interested in this, because I don't know, it's like a 20-page publication. Gives some really good information on herbal leys. Anyways, I don't know how accurate this is, so I'm not saying I know for sure, but according to them, there's some study that showed over 50 years, this was the mineral decline, and it's just general meat, so it's beef, chicken, it's all lumped together. We can't parse it out, but just overall, the nutritional decline in our meats for Na is sodium, so sodium content of meats have gone down by 30%, potassium 16%, phosphorus almost 30%, magnesium 10%. And here's the thing, calcium, which is vital for not just plant nutrition, but for animal and people nutrition, has gone down by over 40%. Iron, over 50%, copper, almost 25%. So again, I don't know how accurate this is, but let's just say that they're if the actual content is half that, things are not looking good, would be a good way of putting it. So here's where I'm going to show you some research. Now, the first one is something I just saw about 2 weeks ago. So I was in Asheville, North Carolina for a conference. Amanda Grev, who did this research with one of her colleagues, was there and did a poster presentation. And I was intrigued by it, and so we've corresponded since. She sent me some data on this. So she did this in kind of, Maryland is a weird-shaped state, but in that real skinny part, that was the farm that she looked. It was a grazing dairy, and basically, it was a grazing dairy that came to her because they were wondering what kind of nutritional content were in those herbs versus the typical pasture plants. So she's only done this for one year. She's going to continue it for at least one more, maybe 2 more years. So think of this as preliminary data because it really is just based on 1 year. I'm going to walk you through the first one just so we're all on board here. This is for phosphorus, but all the ones will be set the same way. So we'll have orchard grass on the left. That effectively is going to be the control. In other words, that's the typical pasture plant. And she has more than just chicory and plantain. She has all sorts of what most of us would call weeds, so you can look at all of them, but I'm going to focus on chicory and plantain. So she's got burdock, candle thistle, chicory, which I'm going to focus on, curly dock, dandelion, which is a really good forb and a good wild one, and then plantain. Now, I'm going to focus on the orchard grass, chicory, and plantain, just for simplicity, kind of quickly go through them. And to help you kind of navigate that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the baseline at the orchard grass. So on each one of these, you're going to have a red line, that's a baseline. And I'm going to show 2 green or blue dots for the chicory and plantain so we can very quickly look at the differences. Everyone see what we're going to do? So I'm going to fly through this just so we don't spend an hour just on the nutritional content here. Here's potassium. So again, there's your baseline. And so chicory is what? About a probably 25% increase in terms of potassium. Plantain is about even, slightly less, but probably not statistically different. Calcium, we talked about how important calcium is, right? Here's the baseline for calcium. Look at the difference between our typical pasture plant and chicory and, whoops, let me back up, chicory and plantain. Chicory is what, about 4 times the calcium content, and plantain is what, about 8 times, roughly, the calcium content. And that was really one of the biggest deficiencies in terms of reduction in our meat quality, right? So to me, that might be huge. We'll look at calcium here a little bit later. Here's magnesium. looks like what, about a 30–40% increase in both chicory and plantain compared to the orchard grass. Here's manganese, so about a 35% increase for chicory, a slight decrease in plantain. We can't be perfect. Here's copper, probably a 15–20% increase in copper on both those compared to the typical pasture plant. Here's zinc. So zinc, what, is supposed to be very important for fighting off diseases, fungus, so forth with the plant. I'm not sure exactly in humans, but look at the difference in zinc. It's almost, probably not quite, but close to 50% in chicory and probably what, 30–35% in plantain. All right, so here's the typical mineral composition of kind of your average, you know, if you go out to your typical feed store and get mineral, it's probably gonna look something like that. Now, let me hold this down. Now, salt will always be the highest, right? Because they mix in there, but throw salt all out of that. What is the next highest ingredient in that mineral? It's calcium, right? So we'll come back to that here in a second. In other words, the cattle, livestock need a lot of calcium, and if we look at the deficiencies in terms of meat content, what did that tell us? They're probably not getting enough. And by the way, just because it's in a bag, is all that going to be bioavailable for the animals? The answer is no, right? And so the best way to feed mineral is not through a bag. The best way to feed mineral is through what? Through the plants itself. And what if we could do that? And what if Amanda's one-year research is somewhat accurate? And what if we have those kind of true differences every year? Could that be a game changer in terms of nutritional deficiencies? Yes? Yep, good question. So just to repeat, and so they can record it, the question was, will the stage of growth have impact in terms of the mineral content? Answer is almost absolutely. I don't know for sure. Typically, like energy, protein will go down, but for minerals, they may actually go up as a plant. I don't know that for sure. Don't quote me on that. I don't know. I'm just saying yes, it would, but we haven't got that far. This is first stage research. Let's give us a few years to get at that level of detail. I don't know. Yeah. So is this going to be a really long question? Because if it is, okay, get right to it because we're not going to have time.
Sorry. So they're often always say chicory is weak and treat it as if get rid of it.
Yeah.
Do you know why?
Spray the piss out of it.
Yeah. Why? Do you know why?
So typically in a pasture situation, it's there for a reason because you probably have compacted soil. So number one, the chicory is not going to grow well. It's probably the only thing that can grow well because that deep taproot can do what? Can break through that compaction. So that's probably part of it. The other part is what we're talking about are improved varieties or bred specifically for better forage production, leafier growth, et cetera. So it's a combination, but in general, weeds are pretty much any quote weed is there for a purpose. Chicory and plantain, generally they're there if you have them in your pastures because you have a compaction problem. And if you have areas that you have a lot of that, I can almost guarantee you have a compaction problem there. So the reason they're growing, they're not doing very well is not because they don't have the potential to grow well, it's because they're the only thing that probably can grow in that spot. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's move on. So here's the other research I wanted to show you. This came out a couple years ago. It's done in England, so it's with their traditional Herbal Leys. So they did a traditional Herbal Ley, which was not just the Forbs, but the grass and clover with a grass legume, traditional grass legume pasture. So the only difference, same grasses and clovers, they just added about a third of the total stand would have been the deep-rooted Forbs. That's the difference on the left. Yeah, and roughly about a third of the biomass was in Forbs in that Herbal Ley. Now, this is typical for a research study. They don't have a whole lot of funding, so they can't do it for 5 or 10 years, which they should if you know we really want to see what the long-term changes are. But they did it for 2 years. Hopefully they'll continue it, and I'm going to try to contact, see if I can get more information. But they established the plots in 2020, and they actually did take some data measurements fall of 2020, but it was just a few months after, so I would say they're not worth even looking at. But then they took them the next year. So we're basically just looking at 1 year data here, so realize that things can and will change. But think more, don't think of exact percentage first, but think of overall, what's the trend here? So that's what I'd encourage you to do. So these are what they measured. You know, they don't have everything but calcium, magnesium, et cetera. We'll go through each one. On the right, I'm going to show you what the percentage change was from the herbal lay compared to the grass legume lay, okay? So for calcium, again, what did we say about calcium? Looks like it's deficient in meat. We have to put a lot of it in our mineral. Now, remember, this is a little bit different because the previous study, it was 100%, you know, it was all or none, right? Not a mix. Here we've got a mix. It's only about a third of the stand, so we wouldn't expect the percent to be as high, but we still got, what? An 86% increase in calcium levels by just having 1/3 of that stand in that herbal lay. Magnesium, 36%, potassium, not much, sodium, huge increase. And again, if we go back to that nutritional deficiency, sodium was the other big deficiency it was iron, calcium, and sodium. Copper, almost a 40% increase, manganese, 27, selenium, 50%. Now, we didn't talk about selenium, and this is just what I have read. I don't know if this is true, but what I've heard is selenium is even more important in our area with the fescue because for some reason selenium helps counteract some of the problems with fescue toxicosis. Don't know how true that is. I've just read that. So a 50% in selenium in this area could be a huge benefit, right? Potentially. And then zinc, 25% increase. So again, this is 1 year. Those will change. But overall, what is the general trend that you see here? Joseph, looks pretty good. Comparable to those tractor tire punctures that you're growing? Okay. All right, so here are this kind of performance results between the two. So forage production was 13% increase, not huge, but I guess what I'd point on all this was just after 1 year. And from my experience, it's gonna take a few years for those roots to really go down deep. In other words, first year, they're not gonna be that deep. They're starting to develop. So again, I don't know, I would like to see more data, but I think these will only get better if you look at this 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Protein, 36% increase. Energy was about the same. And so to me, the most important ones are at the end, and this would be on a per animal basis. And by the way, this is with sheep, so they graze this with sheep. But live weight gain was almost 20% better. So in other words, instead of weaning a 60-pound lamb, you would wean a 72-pound lamb. Could that be over the course of all your animals, would that be a pretty big difference? And here's where it's most interesting. Again, this is just 1/3 of the stand in the herbal lays, but the parasite burns, again, this was with sheep. So who here has sheep? I used to have sheep. Between sheep and cattle, which ones are a bigger problem with parasites? Hands down, sheep. So in other words, if you see what I'm gonna show you with sheep, I mean, to me, this is huge. So with sheep, it showed almost an 80% reduction in internal parasites in that herbal lay by having 1/3. So I would say, forget about all the other great things we've seen here. If the only benefit was that, especially, and for the cattle people, if you are like me and even if you're not certified organic, if you're trying to move in that direction, and by the way, last year was the first year I completely cut out worming, having something like that naturally deworms your animals, would that be a beneficial? Yeah. So again, just 1 year, we need to see more data, but overall, does the trend look good? Good enough for me where I'm gonna probably up the amount of Forbs I have in my pastures. All right, so a few more pictures here. Again, I stole this slide. Again, this comes from that 20-page PDF. I highly recommend if you're interested, go to that. It's got some good information along with the Newman Turner book. But look at some of these species. So these are the ones that I'm using the most. Chicory, again, ribgrass is plantain. This is in England or New Zealand, and then burnet. Look at the root structures, and they don't have, you know, clovers or our typical orchard grass and fescue, but probably the mustard would be the root system you typically see in terms of depth on our typical pasture plants. So again, the root depths in terms of where they're going down to is just absolutely amazing. Now, I actually did try sandfoin last year. It was a complete failure, but I only did it on one farm. That's the farm that I'm rebuilding, what I did not know until about 2 weeks ago when I was doing more research on this is that sandfoin needs really high calcium levels, so really high pH levels. So on that farm, my pH on average is like 5.11, maybe 6.0, and what they're saying is you need to have your pH levels in the 6.5 to 7, or your calcium levels where you're 70% or more base saturation, which I don't have anything close to on that farm. So all I'm saying is it was a complete failure last year. It germinated wonderfully. I mean, not wonderfully, but it germinated well enough where I said, oh my God, I'm going to have like this incredible stand. I'm all excited because they've got this beautiful red flowers. They're real tall. They're supposed to attract bees and pollinators and so forth. And I just kept watching every week, and they just didn't grow. They put on their first true leaf, and they just didn't grow. They just stayed there while all the other things kind of went around, and they finally died out. It was like one of the most depressing things I could ever imagine. So what I'm saying is if you're going to try sandfoin, don't go out and buy like $1,000 a seed. In fact, don't even buy 50 pounds because I think it's $6 a pound. And I'll show you where you can buy this. Buy like in the company I'm going to show you later on, they will allow you to do 10 or 20 pounds. Get like 10, 20 pounds, experiment, see how it does, but put it on your best pH soils if you're going to try it, would be my recommendation. But you can see, look at that taproot. If you can get that kind of taproot in your system, it does even better than our chicory, plantain, and burnet. Now, what they call lucerne is alfalfa. That's what they call it out there. Again, it's not a true forward, but look at that taproot, and that's why they're including it in this also. Again, the two that I would love to get seed for that have not been able to find is yarrow and sheep's parsley. So, and I'm serious. If you find some, even if it's in England and it's going to cost us $200 to ship it here or something like that, I might just do it. I might go in with you. So let me know if you're interested. All right, so what I'm going to show you here, and I stole this, hopefully I don't get sued, but it's for educational purposes, so it's for our, so don't turn me in, please. I'm giving her credit here. So you probably all know, or hopefully know, Christine Jones has done some wonderful work with soil health, and I've probably learned as much from her about soil health as I have anyone else, in person or not. And what she's showing here, so this is, you can get online and find lots of good things, but this is just a quick snippet. So she's actually from Australia, but this is a farm she worked with in New Zealand. And don't look at the front, because that's where they've got the Herbal Ley, the Forbs, but look in the background. That is typically 99% of New Zealand, that's what it looks like. All it is a white clover, perennial ryegrass mix, maybe with a few other little things in there. And they do wonderfully there because it's a cool climate, they get a lot of rainfall, and it works well. But the root system is really small, and so they're only typically going to build organic matter in that top 4 or 5 inches. So this is just wonderful what she showed you. So again, this is a farm, I think it's a grazing dairy that she worked with, and they incorporated some of the herbs. I think it looks like it's mostly chicory, but they do have plantain. It's just the chicory did so well you can't see some of the other things. So this next picture is what, and this looks a little bit different than what typically looks on the computer, so it's hard to see. But the reason she's showing this is this was an area that was derived from volcanic soil or volcanic ash, and so it's really light. And so, in other words, there's zero organic matter when it started. When plants came in, all the organic matter you can see so easily because it's contrasted to that really light color. And so if you look there, that's exactly what you'd expect. All that organic matter is in the top 4 or 5 inches because that's as far down as those roots go. Now the next picture I'm going to show you is after they put in that Herbal Ley, and it was only after a couple of years. It wasn't like 10, 20 years down the road. It was like, it didn't have a whole lot of time to do this. And I want you to see what that soil looked like. I mean, to me, almost unbelievable. Other than I've seen it and read enough from Christine Jones where I don't think she's trying to pull something on us. I think she's actually, in fact, she said when and that was the farmer that did that, and she said after he took the first spade, he said there must have been a stump or something here, like 50 years ago, and that's why there's organic matter. So he went like 10 feet away, did another one, same thing. Then he went another 10 feet, did the same thing. And she said he went crazy. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. In like 15, 20 minutes, he had like 100 holes that he dug all over there. And she said everyone was exactly the same. So she was staying at a hotel or something like that, so went back to the hotel that night. The next morning, she had this idea, and she called him really early. And she said, you know what, there's a chance maybe just something changed, microbially, not just there, but everywhere, on the farm. And she said, would you go to a different pasture, dig it up just to make sure something like that? And she said it was really early morning, and there was a pause, and he said, I've already done that, because I thought the same thing. So, again, I did not witness it, but I've got to assume that this is accurate, but this is why we have research, right, Nate? We've got to verify some of these things, right? But sometimes our research needs to come from what? Observation, things that we see. All right, so this is, in the spring and fall, my herbal ley will look something like this. This is on the new farm that I've been developing for the last 6 years. It will be predominantly the Forbs, so chicory, plantain, and the burnet. Now, I'm going to show you something here. Very quickly, so there's chicory again, just in case some of you aren't familiar. There's plantain, and you can't see it very well, but in the same just few square foot area, I've got all three, and there's burnet. I know what I'm looking for, so there's a pretty good mix of all those in there. But what I want to point out here again, this is from Coltswold seed. This is based in England conditions, so the green is their typical grass growth curve, and so we got a lot in spring, and it tails off obviously in summer and fall. Now, the orange one is what, on average, with all those herbs, what their herbal growth rate is. So it has a lot better summer production than the grass does, right? But what I found out is, in Kentucky, given our climate in the summertime, it's very different than England. So the same herbs that grow really good in the summer in England, they still grow better than grass here in Kentucky, but they don't grow anything like what we're looking at there. So what I found out very quickly is, if we relied on that in the summertime, I would not have very good summer production. So this is where I had to change the system. And given what I first presented before Herbal Leys, what do you think we're going to try combining here? The pasture cropping, right? And given how I don't like to no-till anything, what do you think we're going to try pasture cropping in with our Herbal Leys? The annual Lespedeza, right? And so if you come to my place in the summertime, on the Herbal Leys section up on top, that's what it's going to look like. That was in midsummer. So all that, you can see the low-growing, bushy, that is annual Lespedeza. Now, you can see some of the bowling of the chicory, but if I zoom in, you can definitely see the chicory in there, right? Now, I had a friend, I was in New York for about a week, where I'm originally from, last summer, and he had not been there for years, and I was telling him about what should be in there, and he said, Greg, there's no plantain, no chicory, perfect. And I said, Jeff, it's in there, it's just, it's engulfed by that annual Lespedeza. He didn't believe me, but it was there, and because the chicory hadn't been bolted out like you see in this picture. So those Forbs will be there, but they're just almost semi-dormant in the summertime. And when the annual Lespedeza doesn't die off, but it slows down to set seed in beginning of September, then those herbal, the plantain, chicory, and the burnet, they will start coming up above, and they will start taking over. And the other thing I do in October, I do the fall pasture cropping. In other words, I put in the rye and wheat, and I do a mix of the two now. I see that typically in October, sometimes November, just broadcasting it. And so I will have no growth that fall or winter to graze, but late winter and early spring the next year, that's typically what it's going to look like. So in other words, I almost get 3 crops in one there. And just my little pitch for bale grazing, can you all see those areas of incredible forage production versus not? So that's where I bale grazed on that. And I had to put a pause, and I know let's skip that because we're going to run out of time. All right, Forb establishment. Since we have like 8 minutes, I'm going to go through this quickly. Let's just say that you need mostly bare ground for it to establish. You can't, in my experience, you can't typically frost seed it like you would clover, in established perennial pasture. If you do, you're going to have to suppress that pasture really heavily to be able to do that, in my experience. Typically, it's a complete renovation. This is what they did in England. So they basically plowed it up and then put in that 4 or 5, 6 year Herbal Leys, sometimes longer. So you can do that, and it's probably worth it for some of the, particularly if you have crop ground that you rotate, like John Bell talked about. If you have crop ground that you're rotating some, it's a perfect place to put it in because you won't have to do any plowing. You can simply broadcast that on that ground, and it will take wonderfully. In fact, that's what I did. The Herbal Ley that I have, when I bought the farm, that had been cropped for about 200 years. So I started with pretty much blank slate because it had been cropped for 200 years, and that's how I got that Herbal Ley established. Seeding rates, if you're doing a full renovation, chicory, it's tiny seed. It's smaller than clover seed. So 2 to 4 pounds is an amazing amount. So you don't need much, probably 2 to 4 pounds of that. If you're overseeding, again, I've had limited success, but it's still worth trying. If you're going to do it, it needs to be on a pasture that was hit hard that winter. So like if you're bale grazing or unrolling hay, or if you got a sacrifice lot, it'd probably work there too. Although I would argue you probably shouldn't have a sacrifice lot. But that's where you're going to want to do it. Only thing I'll point out here, this is again from Green Cover Seed. This is their frost. They have a frost seeding mix you can buy if you can afford the shipping on it. But what I was amazed by is, because no one else that I've ever met has promoted Korean Lesbodisa, but they have the common red and white clover that they have in their mix. Then they have Korean Lesbodisa. I've never run into anyone. So Green Cover Seed is advocating Korean Lesbodisa also, which for the same reason they say it thrives during the heat of the summer. But then here's what I was amazed by. They also have chicory and plantain in that mix. So again, I have not had great success overseeding, but I've only done it in very limited, couple limited times. So to me, if Green Cover Seed is saying it can be done, it probably can be done. And all I'm saying is I would encourage you to try it. Again, don't go out and buy 1,000 pounds of seed and frost seed your whole farm, but try it on a few areas, especially if you overwintered there and you've set that back a little bit, would be my recommendation. What I would do if I was overseeding, you don't need 1 to 3 pounds at most. Again, they're tiny little seeds. I would not do Burnett. Probably I would start with chicory and plantain because the seeds are so small, they're probably more easily to incorporate into the ground. So I would just do chicory and plantain. Experiment with other things, but I wouldn't do a whole lot of them for initial part. Where I would start, so who here bale grazes? All right. So if you bale graze, what I found is those are the easiest place on my farms where I can get those herbs established because you have a good seed bed. So an average seed bed at the end of the winter will look something like that. As long as you don't have a whole lot of hay waste, all that seed will take very well. In fact, it's a perfect seed bed for anything you want there, but particularly chicory and plantain. The more disturbance you have, though, the better you will have for the chicory and plantain. So the more disturbance you have like that, and even that was probably one of the top 4 or 5 disturbed areas I had in 2 farms like 3 or 4 years ago. And I'm going to show you what it looked like after I seeded it down to my herbal mix. And I'll zoom in on that, and you've seen that picture actually, right? The reason so there's only 5% of the seed is probably chicory and plantain, that mix, but where it's compacted like that, they are the only thing that can break through that compaction layer, so they will thrive there. It will look like you almost have a complete stand. So I'm going to show you this. That is another impact area where I bale grazed the previous winter. This is 2 years ago, and I took this picture. What I'm going to show you here is how much cattle love these Forbs. So I'm going to show you, so this was in September when we had a fairly decent drought going on. In fact, this is when we had your field day. So now you had it worse there, but that was a pretty bad drought, right? So this was right around the time that you had the field day. So what I was doing is I was giving very small strips. They were actually bale grazing. You don't see the hay there, but somewhere close by they had access to hay. But that is where the fence was, and I took it down, and when the cattle realized that fence was down, where did they go? Folks, sometimes you just have to observe the cattle. The cattle are telling me what? Do they love those herbs? Because they had a half-acre pasture there, and they knew what was there because they were on the other side of that fence. All right, so we're running out of time. I'm just about here. Another thing from Christine Jones, she says if you have 4 functional groups, whether it's pasture or row crop ground that you're putting cover crops in, that's when you're going to get the maximum soil benefits and organic matter buildup. Now, the nice thing that I learned from reading some of our work is each Forb is a different functional group, or at least the Forbs I'm putting out. Some Forbs may be in the same, but chicory, plantain, and Burnett are all different functional groups. So if you have those 3, you have 3 functional groups. If you have a grass and clover, in addition to that, you have 5. If you have those 3 plus annual Lesbodisa, you have 4, right? If you have wheat and rye, you have a 6th functional group, right? So in other words, you can very easily get to what she wants you to have for maximal soil benefits. Where to start? So again, those impact zones. The easiest place that you can get these established, and it's going to take time to get a lot of it, but are where you bale graze or where you, so another reason to bale graze. You can easily get those Forbs established where you bale graze the winter before. Or if you're going to do it in a wintered area that was severely set back. So in other words, almost you hit it too hard. You fed too much hay in that area, or you left them there once it started greening up and you set the grass back. The easiest one would be land coming out of crops. So kind of like what John Bell is doing. If you're doing a rotation, you have land coming out of crops, perfect place to get that herbal ley established. You can't ask for an easier place. So the last thing I'm going to point out is, in the end, we are looking for performance and health on the cattle. So this was a bred heifer that ended up going to a grass-based dairy less than a month after I took the picture. I think she calved a month after that or something. Look at that pasture. She's out on those herbal leys all summer. Does she look healthy? I'll show you one more set of slides. So we talked about grass finishing cattle. So this would have been the last set of, so I only finished 2 animals on that farm last year because I had a bunch that are younger that were coming on. So this summer I'll have a bunch that come off this farm. But previous to this year, it was summer of 2024 where I had a decent sized group that came off. And this is what they averaged. So they had carcass weights that averaged over 900 pounds. And then in terms of back fat and marbling, these were all graded by USDA grader. They all graded choice. So I'm not a superstar grazer. I don't know exactly, but all I can tell you is the performance of my cattle has steadily gone up as I've incorporated those herbs into that pasture. Am I 100% sure it's due to the herbal leys? No, but I can tell you it's a big part of it. So I think that's it. Here, I'm going to leave this up. Those are the additional resources, and we have time for hopefully a few questions. No questions?
You are a superstar grader.
Andre, surely you've got some questions here. Yes? Yes. Yes. No. So there were 2. One is in progress. It's from Maryland. Those are preliminary results. The other one was a published study from England. Yeah, the one that had all of them on one page, that was from England. That was peer-reviewed study. The first one was from Maryland. Those were preliminary results after 1 year. She's going to do it for another 1 or 2 years. So again, they're short-term studies. They may change, but overall, what did you see? On average, for most minerals, was there a pretty big bump compared to our conventional? Yeah, and that's what I guess I would stress. Yeah. The specifics may change a lot. Yes?
Think about plants like weed or Queen Anne's lace or things like that, where is it safe for presumption that things with plant roots are going to function this way, or is it not that simple?
I would think so to some degree. The question I would have is how palatable they are. In other words, they can have a lot of nutrients, but if the cattle don't want to eat them, they're not doing you much good, right? I don't know for sure, but that would be my comment there. My cattle won't eat Queen Anne's lace unless I starve them.
Greg, you mentioned perennial ryegrass. Have you ever tried annual ryegrass on any of that?
So in the herbal ley, I thought about it. The reason I haven't done it is because annual ryegrass has later production, and I'm afraid that would choke out my annual lesbides. In other words, the wheat and rye, they are thriving when the annual lesbides is just developing a taproot, and it's not hurting it. My experience with annual ryegrass is you'll have good production up until May when the annual lesbides is trying to grow, and I don't want to. The annual lesbides is so important to me. I do not want to put anything in there. In fact, I use lower seeding rates for rye and wheat than most people will, just because I want to make sure I don't compete too heavily with that annual lesbides.
This nutrient information is just about the forage, not really reflecting hay, right?
Correct. It's the actual plant. Like the one in Maryland, she literally just hand grabbed the individual plants in a 50-foot area or something from Transex. I forget the details, but and then sent those hand samples directly into the lab to have analyzed. Yeah.
When you broadcast seed, do you just broadcast over damaged areas, or do you say you select the pasture, you do the whole pasture? When it comes to your herbal ley or even the lesbides, do you broadcast seed?
So the question was, So I think there are two questions here. One is if I'm doing the Forbs for the herbal lay part, where do I broadcast those? If it's a bale grazed area, and if I haven't abused the overall pasture much, which is the normal case, I will only seed into what I call the impact zones. In other words, if the hay was set right here, you'll have a circle about, I don't know, 20 foot wide or in radius that will be impacted. I will just literally, if there's no wind, I'll stand in the middle with a hand broadcaster and just do a 360. If there's a little wind, you just have to figure out where to be exactly. Now this year I'm going to maybe try more pastures given what I've seen with green cover seed, what they're saying, but typically the only time I'll broadcast the Forbs on a wide pasture is if I, for whatever reason, like last year we got all that extra rain that we weren't expecting. So I had one pasture that had way more impact that I'd want anyone here to see. I did seed that whole thing into chicory and plantain plus some clovers and other things. I did notice I had pretty good plantain take on that. Chicory didn't seem to do as good. I had really good plantain compared to any other time I've done it. But again, I'm still learning on some of this. But in general, I would, on a good healthy sod, I would probably not go in and overseed the whole thing with chicory and plantain. Now I will with annual Lespedeza. But you either need to do annual Lespedeza on a sod that isn't super healthy to begin with, or you set it back that winter by overgrazing it somehow. Yeah. All right, my contact information, I guess, is not on that slide. Let me go one more. But if you have other questions, feel free to give me a call, send me an email. There we go. There's my number, email address. But I would, if you are interested in this, I would highly recommend the Newman-Turner book, Fertility Pastures. That Cultswold seed reference is pretty good. You're not going to get anything close to information as you would in the Newman-Turner book. But if you have 15 or 20 minutes to spend on learning more about it, go to the Cultwood seed PDF. And if that interests you, buy the Newman-Turner book. Again, if I could only have read one book on pasture-based farming, it would be the Newman-Turner book, hands down.